Picture this. You're sitting across from your boss who just fired you illegally. With no written notice, no explanation, just a cold dismissal after 7 months of perfect work. And when you look him dead in the eye and say, "This isn't over," he actually has the nerve to ask if you're threatening the company. That's exactly what happened to me 3 years ago in Italy. And what I said next? Well, it changed everything. I looked at my soon-to-be ex-boss and replied, "Threats are for people who aren't sure they'll win. I'm making a promise. It's just a matter of time." Fast forward 1 year later, and their lawyer was practically begging me to name my settlement price to avoid going to trial. The amount? A 5-figure sum that they paid without a single complaint. But here's the kicker: when we finally got to court, the judge didn't just congratulate me for my thoroughness. She actually turned to my former boss and said something that made my entire year of legal battles worth it. Stick around, because this story of workplace exploitation, illegal termination, and the sweetest revenge you can imagine is about to get very, very satisfying. Before we dive into this absolute masterclass in workplace justice, if you've ever felt powerless against a boss who thought they could walk all over you, this story is going to hit different. We're talking about a revenge so perfectly executed, so thoroughly documented, and so legally devastating that it reads like fiction. But every single word is true, and I have the court documents to prove it. If you're ready for one of the most satisfying workplace revenge stories you'll ever hear, one that involves fake contracts, workplace nepotism, angry bosses making terrible legal decisions, and a settlement that made all the stress worth it, then smash that like button right now. Hit subscribe if you love stories where the underdog not only wins but wins big. And buckle up, because we're about to take a deep dive into how sometimes, just sometimes, karma doesn't just come around, it comes around with interest. Trust me, by the end of this story, you're going to understand exactly why their lawyer was begging for a settlement, and why the judge had some very choice words for my former employers. Let's get into it. It was 3 years ago, and I was 35, working as an SEO copywriter and social media manager for what I thought was a legitimate Italian company. The kind of place that looked professional on the outside, had a decent reputation, and seemed like it could be a stable career move. I should have known something was off during the hiring process. When they hired me, and I'm using air quotes here because, as you'll see, that word is doing a lot of heavy lifting, they didn't offer me a standard employment contract. Instead, they insisted I open something called a partita IVA, which is basically Italy's version of an independent contractor tax number. "You'll work as a freelancer," they explained, with smiles that I now realize were hiding something much more sinister. "It's better for everyone this way. More flexible. More opportunities." The reality? I worked exclusively for them. 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, reporting directly to 2 bosses. The big boss, who was the general manager, and his sidekick, the mini boss. No flexibility. No other clients. No other opportunities. Just the same schedule, same office, same responsibilities as every other employee. Except without any of the legal protections that come with actual employment. This arrangement wasn't just unfair. It was illegal under Italian labor law. But I was 35, needed the work, and they assured me that through their connections I'd eventually build a freelance network. "You'll thank us later," they said. "This is how business works." Spoiler alert. I never thanked them. And the business connections? They never materialized. Not even close. But here's the thing about exploitation: it rarely starts with the big, obvious stuff. Starts small. It starts with little compromises that seem reasonable at the time. It starts with employers who know exactly which laws they're breaking and exactly why they can probably get away with it. For 7 months, I told myself it was fine. I was getting paid. I was building experience. I was doing work I actually enjoyed, creating content, managing social media strategies, writing copy that converted. I was good at it too. Really good. My performance reviews were glowing. Management praised my work constantly, both in person and in writing. Customers sent emails specifically complimenting my campaigns. I never missed a deadline. I never made excuses. I showed up every single day and delivered exactly what they asked for, when they asked for it. I should have been the model employee, except of course I wasn't technically an employee at all. Now, every good workplace revenge story needs its villains, and boy did this place deliver. Because while I was busting my ass to prove myself as a freelancer with no job security, there were 2 other women in the office who seemed to operate by completely different rules. Let me introduce you to the mini boss's girlfriend and the big boss's mistress, both on payroll, both completely, utterly, spectacularly terrible at their jobs. The mini boss's girlfriend worked in customer service, and I use the word worked very loosely here. Her typical day involved showing up late, spending most of her time on personal calls, and somehow managing to create more problems than she solved. Customers would call in with simple questions, and she'd either give them wrong information or transfer them to someone else to deal with. But the big boss's mistress? She was something else entirely. Officially, she was supposed to handle project coordination, but in reality, she was a masterclass in how to avoid responsibility while collecting a paycheck. I watched this woman take credit for other people's work, blame her mistakes on everyone else, and somehow turn every meeting into a discussion about her personal drama. She'd miss deadlines, show up unprepared for client presentations, and then act shocked when things went wrong. The worst part? When their incompetence created extra work, which it did, constantly guess who got to fix it? That's right. The freelancer who was supposedly just there temporarily. I'd stay late cleaning up their messes. I'd redo presentations they'd botched. I'd smooth things over with clients who were frustrated by their lack of professionalism. And every time I did, I'd get a pat on the head and a thanks for being a team player. Meanwhile, these two were untouchable. They could show up late, leave early, make mistake after mistake, and face absolutely zero consequences. Why? Because they were sleeping with the bosses. Now, I'm not someone who usually rocks the boat. I prefer to keep my head down, do good work, and let results speak for themselves. But there's only so much blatant favoritism and incompetence a person can watch before they start speaking up. And speak up I did. It started small. A comment here and there about missed deadlines. A suggestion that maybe we should have better quality control processes. Nothing aggressive, nothing personal. Just professional observations about how we could improve our workflow. But in a workplace built on nepotism and exploitation, even professional feedback becomes a threat. I remember the exact moment I crossed from valuable team player to problem employee. It was a Tuesday morning, and we had a client presentation at 10 a.m. The big boss's mistress was supposed to have the project proposal ready, but at 9:45, she casually mentioned that she forgot about it. Not that she was running behind, not that she needed a few more minutes. She literally forgot that we had a major client presentation and hadn't prepared anything. I watched our team scramble to throw together something presentable in 15 minutes. I watched the clients' faces when they realized we were winging it. I watched a potential six-figure deal slip away because someone couldn't be bothered to do the most basic part of her job. And when the big boss asked what went wrong in the post-mortem meeting, his mistress actually had the audacity to say, "Well, I didn't get the information I needed from the team." That's when I snapped. "Actually," I said, and I could feel the temperature in the room drop, "you had all the information you needed 3 weeks ago. We discussed it in 2 separate meetings, I sent you follow-up emails with all the details, and I even offered to help you prepare the presentation." The problem wasn't lack of information. The silence that followed was deafening. The big boss's face went red. The mini boss's girlfriend suddenly found her phone very interesting. And the mistress? She looked at me like I just committed treason. "I don't appreciate that tone," the big boss finally said. "And I don't appreciate watching good opportunities get wasted because of poor preparation," I replied. It was the truth. It was professional. It was completely reasonable. And it was apparently the beginning of the end. After that meeting, everything changed. Not dramatically at first, they were too smart for that. But I could feel the shift in every interaction, every conversation, every email. Suddenly, my work was being scrutinized more heavily. Projects I'd been handling independently were now requiring multiple approvals. Ideas I proposed in meetings were dismissed, only to be discovered by someone else a week later. The mini boss's girlfriend started making snide comments about freelancers who think they run the place. The big boss's mistress would roll her eyes whenever I spoke in meetings. And both bosses became noticeably cooler in their interactions with me. But here's the thing about workplace retaliation. When you're good at your job, it's hard to find legitimate reasons to get rid of you. My performance was still excellent. Clients were still happy with my work. Deadlines were still being met. So they got creative. They started excluding me from important meetings, then acting surprised when I wasn't up to speed on new developments. They'd change project requirements without telling me, then express disappointment when my work didn't meet the new, secret, standards. They'd pile extra responsibilities on my plate while talking about right-sizing the team. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, and they were hoping I'd quit on my own. But I didn't quit. I documented everything. Every email that excluded me from discussions I should have been part of. Every meeting where decisions were made without my input, then blamed on my lack of involvement. Every instance where my work was criticized for not meeting standards that had never been communicated to me. I saved screenshots of conversations. I kept copies of original project briefs and the revised versions I received days later. I maintained a detailed log of every interaction, every change in treatment, every sign that they were building a case to get rid of me. I didn't know it at the time, but I was building the foundation for the most satisfying revenge of my professional career. 7 months. That's how long I lasted in their toxic little ecosystem before they finally made their move. And when they did, they made every mistake in the book. It was a Thursday morning, and I was in the middle of reviewing a campaign performance report when the mini-boss approached my desk. No meeting scheduled, no heads up, no formal process, just a casual walkover like he was asking about lunch plans. "Hey," he said, and I could tell from his tone that this wasn't going to be a friendly chat. "We need to talk." I looked up from my computer, and I could see the nervousness in his eyes. This was a man who was about to do something he knew was wrong, and his body language was screaming it. "Your services are no longer required," he said, just like that. No explanation, no documentation, no formal termination process. Just a casual dismissal delivered like he was ordering coffee. I felt my heart start racing, but I kept my voice steady. "I'd like to speak with the big boss about this." "That won't be necessary," he replied quickly. "Too quickly. This decision has been made. I'm requesting a meeting with the general manager," I said again, more firmly this time. "Request denied." And that's when I smiled. Not because I was happy, I was furious and scared and completely blindsided. But I smiled because in that moment, I realized they just handed me exactly what I needed. No written notice. No formal termination process. No documentation of cause. No opportunity to respond or defend myself. Just an illegal dismissal delivered by someone who clearly had no authority to make that decision. I stood up slowly, gathered my personal items from my desk, and looked the mini-boss directly in the eye. "This isn't over," I said quietly, and that's when he made his second massive mistake. "Are you threatening the company?" he asked, and I could hear the panic in his voice. I smiled again, wider this time. "Threats are for people who aren't sure they'll win. I'm making a promise. It's just a matter of time." The look on his face was priceless. Confusion mixed with fear mixed with the dawning realization that maybe, just maybe, he'd seriously underestimated who he was dealing with. I walked out of that office with my head high, my documentation folder tucked under my arm, and a plan already forming in my mind. The first thing I did when I got home was call a labor attorney. Not just any attorney. I found someone who specialized in Italian employment law violations and had a track record of winning cases against companies that thought they were too clever to get caught. "Tell me everything," she said during our first consultation. And I did. I laid out the fake freelance arrangement that was clearly designed to avoid providing proper employment benefits. I explained how I worked the same hours in the same location with the same responsibilities as regular employees, but without any of the legal protections. I detailed the pattern of retaliation after I spoke up about workplace issues. I showed her my documentation of changed requirements, excluded meetings, and increased scrutiny. And then I told her about the termination itself, how it was delivered verbally, without cause, without documentation, and without following any proper procedures. "This is good," she said, flipping through my folder of evidence. "This is very good. But we need more." "What kind of more?" "We need to prove that this was clearly an employment relationship disguised as freelance work, and we need them to make mistakes that demonstrate bad faith. Can you think of anyone who might be willing to testify about the working conditions?" I thought about my former colleagues, still trapped in that toxic environment, still walking on eggshells around the golden children who couldn't do their jobs. "Probably not," I admitted. "They're all too scared of losing their own positions." "That's okay," she said with a knowing smile. In my experience, companies like this usually provide all the evidence we need themselves. We just have to be patient. She was right. We sent a formal legal communication to the company, outlining our intention to pursue legal action for wrongful termination and labor law violations. It was professional, factual, and legally sound. And then we waited for them to respond. I expected their response to be handled by their legal team. Maybe a form letter denying wrongdoing. Maybe an attempt to negotiate a small settlement to make the problem go away quietly. What I got instead was a gift. The big boss himself responded to my lawyer's formal communication with a long, rambling, absolutely furious email that read like a rant posted on social media at 2 a.m. He called me ungrateful. He said I was a disruptive influence who never appreciated the opportunities they gave me. He claimed I was trying to extort the company and that my allegations were completely fabricated. But the best part, the part that made my lawyer actually laugh out loud when she read it, was when he detailed specific instances of my poor performance that directly contradicted the glowing reviews and praise they documented in their own emails and performance evaluations. He's essentially admitting that they fired you for speaking up about workplace issues, my lawyer explained, while simultaneously providing evidence that their stated reasons for termination are false. And he's doing it in writing, from his official company email address. Gets better. The email also included personal attacks on my character, veiled threats about making sure other companies know what kind of employee I really was, and enough hostile language to demonstrate clear bad faith in their termination decision. This is exactly what we needed, my lawyer said, practically grinning. He just turned a straightforward wrongful termination case into a slam dunk. But we weren't done yet. Because while Italian bureaucracy moves slowly, I had time to gather even more evidence. Over the next 12 months, while our case slowly wound its way through the Italian legal system, I became a master detective of my own employment history. I compiled every email I'd ever received praising my work, every client testimonial, every performance review, every project completion confirmation, every single piece of evidence that demonstrated I was not only meeting expectations but exceeding them right up until the day I was fired. I gathered proof of my working arrangements, photos of my assigned desk, documentation of my regular hours, evidence that I worked exclusively for this company despite being classified as a freelancer. I even found old security logs showing my daily entry and exit times, proving I maintained the same schedule as regular employees. I documented the fake freelance setup in excruciating detail, showing how it violated multiple Italian labor laws designed to protect workers from exactly this kind of exploitation. But the real goldmine was the paper trail of retaliation. Email threads showing how my input was valued before I spoke up about workplace issues, and how it was suddenly ignored afterward. Meeting minutes that proved I was excluded from discussions I should have been included in. Project communications that showed how requirements were changed without my knowledge, then used to criticize my work. By the time we were ready to file, I had assembled a 200-page dossier of evidence. Every email, every message, every document, every photo, all organized chronologically, cross-referenced and professionally bound. My lawyer called it the most thorough documentation she'd ever seen in an employment case. Most people come to me with a handful of emails and their word against their employers, she said. You've built a case that would be impossible to defend against. We filed it the week before Christmas, right in the middle of the holidays when most businesses are winding down and trying to avoid drama. Less than a week after we filed that 200-page dossier, my lawyer's phone rang. It wasn't the big boss this time, apparently. He'd learned his lesson about putting his foot in his mouth. It was their attorney, and according to my lawyer, he sounded absolutely desperate. He wants to settle, she told me during our call. He says they want to avoid the time and expense of a trial, but between you and me, I think they've seen the evidence and realize they have no defense. What are they offering? I asked. That's the thing. He won't make an offer. He's asking us to name our price. That tells me they know exactly how badly they screwed up, and they're hoping we'll be reasonable enough to save them from public embarrassment. We weren't feeling particularly reasonable. After 7 months of illegal employment arrangements, workplace retaliation, and a wrongful termination that violated every basic principle of labor law, we decided they should pay for their arrogance. My lawyer and I calculated damages for lost wages, the stress and hardship of sudden unemployment, the violation of my rights as a worker, and the punitive amount necessary to ensure this company would think twice before exploiting someone else. We asked for a 5-figure settlement. Not enough to bankrupt them, but enough to hurt. Enough to make them remember why following labor laws isn't optional. Their response came back within 24 hours. Accepted. No negotiation. No counteroffer. No attempt to reduce the amount. Just immediate acceptance of our demand. That's when I knew we could have asked for more. The settlement hearing was scheduled for a crisp morning in February, in one of those imposing courthouse buildings that makes you feel like you're stepping into history. I arrived early, dressed in my most professional outfit, carrying a folder with copies of all our key evidence. My lawyer met me at the entrance, looking confident and prepared. "Remember," she said as we walked up the courthouse steps, "this is just a formality. They've already agreed to pay. But judges in these cases sometimes like to make sure everyone understands what happened and why." The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with wood paneling that looked like it had been there for centuries. The big boss and mini boss were already seated with their attorney, and I have to admit, seeing them again after more than a year brought back all those feelings of frustration and anger I'd been carrying. But something had changed. They looked smaller somehow, less intimidating. The big boss, who used to command every room he entered, was hunched over, whispering nervously with his lawyer. The mini boss kept checking his phone like he'd rather be anywhere else. When the judge entered, everyone stood. She was an older woman with sharp eyes and the kind of presence that commanded immediate respect. She reviewed our case file briefly, then looked up at both parties. "This appears to be a settlement agreement for a wrongful termination case," she said. "Before I approve this settlement, I want to make sure I understand what happened here." My lawyer stood and provided a brief summary of the case: the illegal employment arrangement, the retaliation, the improper termination process. She was professional, factual, and devastating. Then the judge turned to me. "Miss Catherine, do you feel this settlement adequately addresses the harm you experienced?" "Yes, Your Honor," I replied. "It does." She nodded, then turned to my former employers. And that's when the magic happened. "Mr. James," the judge said, and her tone was ice-cold professional disapproval, "I've reviewed the evidence in this case, and I want to commend the plaintiff and her attorney for the thoroughness of their documentation. It's rare to see such a complete record of workplace violations." The big boss shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The mini boss was staring at his hands. "However," she continued, "I have to say that your conduct throughout this matter has been appalling. The employment arrangement described in these documents appears designed specifically to deny a worker her legal rights. The termination process violated multiple basic principles of labor law, and your response to the initial legal communication was, frankly, unprofessional and potentially defamatory." I felt a warm glow of satisfaction spreading through my chest. This was better than I'd hoped for. But she wasn't done. "What concerns me most," the judge said, flipping through what appeared to be additional papers, "is that this isn't the first time your company has appeared before this court on employment-related matters. We're honestly tired of seeing your name in these proceedings." My eyes widened. I looked at my lawyer, who was trying very hard not to smile. My former employers were repeat offenders. This wasn't just a one-time mistake or a gray area misunderstanding. This was a pattern. "I'm approving this settlement," the judge concluded, "but I want to make it clear that any future violations will be viewed in light of this established pattern of misconduct. I suggest you take this opportunity to review your employment practices very carefully." As we stood to leave, the judge called out one more thing. "Ms. Name, congratulations on your thorough preparation and successful advocacy for your rights." Walking out of that courthouse, carrying a check that represented more money than I'd made in several months at that job, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year: complete vindication. The weeks following the settlement were surreal. After more than a year of legal stress, document gathering, and preparation, it was strange to suddenly have it all behind me. But the best part wasn't even the money, though I'll admit that 5-figure check felt pretty good when it cleared my bank account. The best part was knowing that their pattern of exploitation had been officially documented, that their illegal practices had been exposed, and that maybe, just maybe, the next person who walked into that office would be treated better because of what we'd accomplished. I used part of the settlement money to take a vacation I'd been putting off for years. I used another part to invest in some freelance equipment that would help me build the legitimate consulting business I'd always wanted. And I kept enough aside to remind myself that sometimes, fighting back is worth it. My lawyer later told me that she'd heard through professional networks that the company had completely overhauled their employment practices following our case. They'd brought in an HR consultant, restructured their hiring processes, and apparently became much more careful about following labor laws. That's the thing about cases like this, she explained. The individual victory is satisfying, but the systemic change is what really matters. You didn't just get justice for yourself. You probably prevented this from happening to other people. Looking back on this experience 3 years later, I'm struck by how many things had to align perfectly for this to work out the way it did. First, I had to be good at my job. If my performance had been genuinely poor, they would have had legitimate grounds for termination, and no amount of documentation would have helped. Second, I had to document everything in real time. Most people don't think to save emails and take screenshots when they're in the middle of workplace conflict. They're focused on trying to fix the situation, not building a legal case. But having that contemporaneous evidence made all the difference. Third, they had to make significant legal mistakes. The illegal employment arrangement, the improper termination process, and especially that angry email response, each of these gave us leverage we wouldn't have had otherwise. But most importantly, I had to be willing to fight. It would have been easier to walk away, find another job, and chalk this up to a bad experience. The legal process was stressful, expensive, and time-consuming. There were moments when I wondered if it was worth it. The answer definitively was yes. Not just because of the money, though that certainly helped during a difficult period. And not just because of the personal satisfaction, though seeing their faces in that courtroom was pretty incredible. It was worth it because exploitation only continues when people are too scared or too tired to fight back. It was worth it because documenting their pattern of misconduct might protect someone else in the future. It was worth it because sometimes the system actually works the way it's supposed to. Occasionally check up on my former employers through professional networks and public records, partly out of curiosity and partly to see if the judge's warning had any lasting impact. From what I can tell, they've cleaned up their act considerably. The company still exists, though they've had significant turnover in management. The big boss and mini boss are both still there, but they seem to be keeping a much lower profile. The mini boss's girlfriend and big boss's mistress? They're both long gone. Whether they left voluntarily or were finally held accountable for their performance is unclear, but either way, the office is probably a much more professional place without them. As for me, I used the experience to launch a successful freelance consulting business, a real one this time with proper contracts, multiple clients, and complete control over my working conditions. I've worked with several companies to help them avoid the exact mistakes my former employers made. And I've become something of an expert in Italian employment law compliance. The best revenge, as they say, is living well. But sometimes legal revenge works pretty well too. This story isn't just about one person getting justice against bad employers. It's about something much bigger than that. Every day, workers around the world face exploitation, illegal treatment, and retaliation for speaking up about problems. Most of the time, people feel powerless against companies with more resources, better lawyers, and systems designed to protect the status quo. But here's what I learned from this experience. Documentation is power. Patience is power. Understanding your rights is power. And sometimes the people who think they're untouchable make mistakes that level the playing field. I'm not saying everyone should rush to sue their employers. Legal action should always be a last resort, and it's not appropriate for every situation. But I am saying that when someone violates your rights, when they exploit your labor, when they think they can get away with illegal behavior because you're just one person, sometimes they're wrong. The system isn't perfect. Justice isn't always served. But in this case, everything worked exactly the way it was supposed to. The people who broke the law face consequences. The person who was wrong got compensation. And hopefully future employees at that company will be treated with the respect and legal protections they deserve. Sometimes karma needs a little help. And sometimes the best way to help karma is with a really good lawyer and 200 pages of meticulously organized evidence. If this story gave you that satisfying feeling of justice being served, Smash that like button right now. Seriously, hit it. This is the kind of content that only gets made when viewers show their support, and your likes tell me you want more stories like this.